Traitor, thief, profiteer, visionary, genius. Those are the names given to Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. This week we are reviewing The Accidental Billionaires, the book that later became David Fincher's The Social Network. Here are 5 things you will love about The Accidental Billionaires. I'm writer and author Scott Seeger, and this is my first review of a nonfiction book turned movie. In 2004, students at Harvard came up with the concept of a new social networking site that would become a sensation in a few short months. If you've ever wondered why people flocked to Facebook when MySpace and Friendster were already around, it was because Friendster was known as more of a dating site, and MySpace was for promoting indie bands and wannabe models. Facebook came along and filled a void that other social media sites at the time were missing, and that leads us to the first interesting aspect of this book. Number 1, Harvard life. The book's opening chapters cover campus life at Harvard. The parties, the class load, the dorms, the food, the sex. It's pretty typical of other college campuses, and interesting to note that Harvard students gripe about taking required cores like folklore and mythology and physics for poets in an attempt to make students more well-rounded. There's a running joke that most Harvard grads know about the Yanomamo tribe in the Amazon rainforest since it was part of an anthropology class they were forced to take. So take a minute to read up on them on Wikipedia. Next time you're at a networking event and come across a Harvard grad, you can blow them away with your obscure knowledge of the secluded Yanomamo tribe. But one aspect of Harvard life that sets it apart from other colleges is the final clubs. These are the ultra-exclusive social clubs that determine if you are the next Fed chairman or Fortune 500 CEO. They require rigorous screening and elimination processes through social gatherings and are passionately sought out by Eduardo Saverin, the future former CFO of Facebook, who dreams of breaking into one. It's at a Jewish fraternity party when Eduardo comes across a socially awkward kid. He was wearing cargo shorts instead of slacks, sandals with no socks. He had a prominent nose, a mop of curly, blondish brown hair, and light blue eyes. There was something playful about those eyes, but that's where any sense of natural emotion or readability ended. His narrow face was otherwise devoid of any expression at all, and his posture, his general aura, the way he seemed to close in on himself even while engaged in a group dynamic, even here in the safety of his own fraternity, was almost painfully awkward. The kid, of course, is the hero of our story, Mark Zuckerberg, or maybe he's the villain. Reading of the minutiae of daily college life grows mundane, but we learn why the author chose to start with this. The concept of Facebook intended to mimic college social interaction. Everyone in college knows a lot of people and they constantly want to know what all their friends are up to, and now you can do that electronically on Facebook. That leads us to the second aspect which shaped the culture of Facebook. Number 2, Harvard's geography. Here's a map of Harvard. Along Massachusetts Avenue is the main fair with the frat houses, final clubs, bars, college apparel shops, you name it. As Harvard grew, they expanded to the northwest and built new student housing in an area known as the Quad. Most campuses have a quad, but Harvard's quad had a negative connotation. The quad wasn't exactly Siberia, but to the students who were quadded at the end of the freshman year, it certainly felt like they were about to be sent to some sort of gulag. It could be argued that this arrangement contributed greatly to the need for Facebook. These students are too busy to interact in the real world, and they live far away from the action of Massachusetts Avenue. They needed some sort of connection that overcame the geographic challenges of being quadded. Therefore, the geography of Harvard contributed greatly to the need for Facebook. And Zuckerberg is kind of crazy. He wears shorts and sandals in the winter, so it stands to reason that he'd want to interact with students on Massachusetts Avenue from the comfort of his dorm, and the book speculates that Zuckerberg would not have it any other way. To an outside observer, the relationship he had with his computer seemed much smoother than any relationship he had with anyone in the outside world. He never seemed happier than when he was looking through his own reflection into the glassy screen. Maybe deep down it had to do with the control, with the computer. Mark was always in control. Or maybe it was more than that, an almost symbiosis that had grown out of years and years of practice. The way Mark's fingers touched those keys, this is where he belonged. Sometimes it probably felt like the only place he belonged. Number 3, the title. Everyone knows what the social network is, but nobody has heard of The Accidental Billionaires. Why did they drop such a great book title for such a generic one like The Social Network? Accidental Billionaires really does get at the heart of what it is to be a startup company. Check out Bill Gross's TED Talk on the subject of what determines a successful startup. He examined many startup successes and failures, which he had been involved in, and he examined factors such as access to capital, quality of the idea, effective leadership, and what he found was the number one determining factor was timing. This is important since it's worth noting that others came up with the social networking idea and procrastinated on them, while Zuckerberg dashed straight to his dorm room and started coding when he came up with his version of the idea of a social network. And it's understandable how this book was turned into a movie. The author's style has a flair of good fiction. I mean, Aaron Sorkin is a talented guy, but most of his work was already done for him. The story arc and dramatic elements are already in the book. This work of nonfiction really does follow like a 3-act structure. In the author's note, Ben Mesrick informs the reader that the recounts are an amalgamation of interviews, like most nonfiction has to be. There are periods of inflection by the Winklevosses and Eduardo that feel like internal dialogue in a fictional book, but that's okay. It adds to the narrative drama of this book. It makes it feel less like a PBS documentary or 60 Minutes interview and more like a Hollywood biopic. The story ascends into a riveting second and third act when enemies are threatening the hero and the hero's best friend turns against him, revealing himself to be a false ally. But who is the hero and who is the traitor, Eduardo or Zuckerberg? The book succeeds greatly in finding a narrative that really draws us in. The antagonist and rising action come at the beginning of the second act when the Winklevoss twins are introduced. The brothers have an idea for a new social networking site called Harvard Connection. They want Zuckerberg to write the code for it. And we, along with the Winklevoss twins, learn a very valuable lesson about business. Number 4, get it in writing. Zuckerberg agrees to look at some of the Winklevoss' existing code, but doesn't seem interested since he's come up with his own idea for a website. He blows off the Winklevoss twins with a series of emails while developing his own site. Maybe it's Zuckerberg's lack of social skills where he doesn't understand that this might create enemies for life. But a few weeks later, when the Winklevosses read about a new social media website called thefacebook.com, designed by Zuckerberg, they are livid. They just know Zuckerberg was blowing them off so he could expand on their idea. It was too similar to what they had hired him to do. Well, not hired exactly. They had never really talked about paying him, just that he'd benefit if they benefited. So the Winklevosses do acquiesce and realize that they never really did write up a contract, and of course the minute detail that Zuckerberg was not to be paid for his time. But that logic does not put out their fiery anger. Every day they hear a new story of Facebook taking off on campus and spreading like wildfire across colleges around the world. As the Stanford Daily on the West Coast reported, classes are being skipped, work is being ignored, students are spending hours in front of the computer in utter fascination. The Facebook.com craze has swept through campus. After that article came out, 85% of Stanford had joined the Facebook within 24 hours. This is the reason why the Winklevosses became so angry and lawyered up. From their point of view, Zuckerberg's executed idea was similar to their concept, and so he surely must have stolen it from them. Around the book's midpoint, a new character is introduced. Zuckerberg meets Sean Parker, the disgraced entrepreneur of Napster, and this is what drives a wedge between Zuckerberg and Eduardo. Sean Parker tells him about his experiences in Silicon Valley and his admiration for what Facebook is and could become. Eduardo describes how Zuckerberg is drawn into Sean Parker's web at their first meeting at a high-end Tribeca restaurant. Sean reached across the table, going right for Mark, and Eduardo saw it. Then and there, the look on Mark's face, the sudden flush in his cheeks, and the brightness in his eyes. Pure idol worship. In Eduardo's eyes, to Mark, Sean Parker was a god. Well, Eduardo is trying to monetize the company by running up and down Madison Avenue looking for advertisers. Sean Parker tells him that their future is with venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. When Eduardo fails at bringing in money and then accepts an internship at Lehman Brothers, Zuckerberg realizes that Sean Parker is right and that Eduardo's heart is really not in the company. That's when Zuckerberg takes the operation to a bungalow on a quiet street in Palo Alto, while Eduardo tries to be the head of the company from New York City. And that leads us to the fifth thing you will love about this book: the women. There's a lot of talk about women and getting laid. If you're a geeky computer nerd but you have the moniker of Harvard, this does not necessarily help you as you might think. Zuckerberg is completely unlayable, and Eduardo Saveron is only slightly less, but they do start meeting women as their reputation for building Facebook grows. At one point, Sean Parker takes him to a nightclub, and Eduardo cannot believe his eyes when Zuckerberg leaves with a Victoria's Secret model. I imagine his awe and envy. Awe that they finally did it, and envy since Eduardo has a girlfriend back in Boston, which limits what he can do with a lingerie model. Eduardo's Boston girlfriend grows impatient with his schedule of running around New York searching for Facebook advertisers. At one point, she sets Eduardo's clothes that he's left in her dorm on fire. The fire department puts it out, and they talk about arresting this woman. It's an amusing episode, but the author put this in the book for good reason. It's a foreshadowing of Eduardo's jealousy of Zuckerberg and Parker's budding relationship. After all, he's trying to run Facebook from New York while the action is in Palo Alto. The East Coast-West Coast situation gives Parker a lot of time to get chummy with Zuckerberg. Eduardo becomes the psycho-jealous girlfriend firebug by setting Facebook on fire, metaphorically. To get Zuckerberg's attention, He closes the company's bank account, which angers Zuckerberg greatly. But this move backfires and causes Zuckerberg to run fully into Sean Parker's open arms and pull the trigger of VC capital that Parker's been soft-selling to Zuckerberg for months. And this move seals the fate of Eduardo's relationship with Zuckerberg and Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg has received his fair share of criticism, and this book documents how he may have stolen the idea for Facebook, then shoved his best friend out of the company they started together. But I wasn't sold on this narrative. This book left me convinced that Zuckerberg deserves his wealth and credit for Facebook. The Winklevosses had an idea, but ideas are as free as the air. You can't actually patent an idea. Most people don't know this. You can only patent ideas that have been turned into inventions. If you come up with an idea that windshield wipers should be intermittent instead of one steady speed, anyone can copy that idea. If you come up with a specialized gearbox that can produce the intermittent effect, then that gearbox is no longer an idea, it's an invention, and that's what you patent. The Winklevoss's idea for Harvard Connection was not particularly original. Facebook itself was not original, as Friendster and MySpace had already been around. There actually was another Harvard student who created a social media site called House System, and many colleges had online student picture sites, but they lacked the interactive features of Facebook. To say the Winklevosses came up with the idea of Facebook is like saying George Lucas invented sci-fi. And that's what Zuckerberg brought to Facebook. Plus, he did do all the work. In high school, he designed Synapsys Media Player, a software that chose music based on a listener's history. Microsoft offered him $2 million, but he refused and instead offered it as a free download. If that sounds like a familiar idea, I'm not aware of Zuckerberg ever suing Pandora. And he did design that goofy website where you compare Harvard women by hotness. He was in the trenches and much more experienced at getting things off the ground compared to the Winklevosses who spent their time rowing crew and feasting on protein. Zuckerberg may have been socially awkward, but he was that person who got things done. And let's face it, if the Winklevosses did come out on top, the book would paint Zuckerberg as the victim. We'd be reading about how these two billionaire brothers who came up with Facebook actually stole the site off a gangly autistic boy who did all the real work. A classic David versus Goliath story, only Zuckerberg got assigned the role of Goliath, and the two 6'5" jocks are the Davids, and the Winklevosses should get it in writing next time. As far as his friend Eduardo, he was a pretty crummy CFO. He was trying to run Facebook from New York while the operation was in Palo Alto. He was schlepping up and down Madison Avenue trying to scrounge for advertisers. The book describes some of the slim pickings he did land. He'd also sold some advertisements to a few Harvard undergraduate organizations, the Harvard bartending course, the Seneca Club's Red Party, the Maher's House annual lather dance. The college Democrats were paying $30 a day to drum up interest in an upcoming trip to New Hampshire. I mean, $30 a day when Sean Parker could put him in touch with San Francisco venture capitalists who would be happy to give them 6 figures in a heartbeat. He was right to push his friend out of the company. I don't doubt that if the Winklevoss twins or Eduardo Saverin were in charge of Facebook, we would have never heard of Facebook. The best line in the movie says it all.
If you guys were the inventors of Facebook, you'd have invented Facebook.
And I try to stay away from comparing the book to the movie, but one detail I need to mention, the movie says Eduardo's shares in Facebook were diluted from 30% down to 0.03%, making Zuckerberg look incredibly douchebaggy. But this isn't true. They were diluted from 30% down to 10%. It's a really strong, dramatic point in the movie, but it's based on complete crap. As of this video's making, Eduardo Saverin's net worth is $14.8 billion. Zuckerberg declined to be interviewed for this book, so it's all told from the perspective of the Winklevoss twins and Eduardo. Even though it's their story told from their point of view, I still wasn't convinced that Facebook wasn't anything but Zuckerberg's vision. This is a great book. Even if you hate Facebook, it gives us a glimpse on how companies are made, and The Accidental Billionaires is a spot-on title. If you enjoy following billionaires and startups, check out my book, Grand Portage, about a billionaire who comes up with a crazy idea of dragging a nuclear aircraft carrier across northern Minnesota for his latest business venture. It's available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. That's it for this week. Don't forget to hit subscribe and never stop reading.